Hello, grade threes. I'm excited that you're back to listen some more of our Who Was King Tut. Today I'll read a couple more chapters. I'm not wearing anything Egyptian today, and you might be wondering why, but today I wanted to focus on, or for the next couple days, I wanted to focus on some experiments and some activities that we can do. I hope to do these with you together in class, but that won't happen. So I still would like to do them with you. After I'm done reading, I'll post something that I'd like to do that was typical in ancient Egypt. So I'd love for you to read and follow along, and then later on you can check back for some other videos. I also posted a math challenge again today, so I'd love for you guys to work on those. And Monday, we will reveal some of the answers. So if you're wondering, how you did in the challenge, check back on Monday and we'll post some answers. All right, so we're on chapter 7, Valley of the Kings. On the day of Tut's burial, so remember we just found out that he died, right? And they buried him in someone else's pyramid, which is where they had their tombs, because his wasn't ready, right? So this pyramid this tomb was much smaller than what one typically would be of a pharaoh. Okay, on the day of Tut's burial, a long line of people followed his coffin in boats across the Nile. So remember, the Nile was very long, and these people were following along on their boats. Once on land, the coffin, actually there was three coffins that he had, was pulled on a sled. It was going to a royal graveyard. This dusty, lonely area west of the Nile was called the Valley of the Kings. In some photographs, the area looked like a natural pyramid made of rock. Many other pharaohs were buried there, so priests stood guard day and night. Remember, they would guard where people would be buried. So nearby was a separate cemetery for queens and members of the court. It was called the Valley of the Queens. At the head of the parade of the Valley of the Kings were the priests. Along the way, they sang songs and chanted prayers. One of the priests wore a mask. He was supposed to represent one of the royals. Tut's young queen walked nearby. Following behind her were a group of women. They would have all been wailing and crying and tearing at their clothes. They're mourners, so people who are sad for someone who had just passed away is called a mourner. They were there to express sadness over Tut's death. After the mourners came servants. Hundreds of servants were following as well. They were carrying all the furniture, food, and other items to go in the tomb. So remember, we talked about being buried with all of your riches and all your stuff. So these people are all carrying his stuff that King Tut's body should be buried with. So here is just a little picture of the funeral kind of parade, as you would call it. So we have the head priest here. You have more priests that followed. And then the people who worked in the palace. And then how they were carrying King Tut's body. And then the servants carrying all of his stuff. And there was also a funeral dancer for entertainment, I guess. And then the women who were crying over his death. Okay, so they also brought along many little statues that looked like servants. Once these were placed in the tomb, it was believed that the statues would come to life. Then the dead king would have all the servants he needed to take care of him. Kind of ridiculous. We know that's not true, but that's what they thought in ancient Egypt. At the entrance of the tomb, Tut's mummy was propped upright. So they stood him up. So you can see right here. This is him. That's King Tut, and they stood him up. The time had come for a very important ceremony. It was called the opening of the mouth. The priest would touch his eyes and mouth and ears. After that, the only thing left to do was bury the pharaoh inside the tomb. Once Tut's mummy was back in the coffin, it was placed inside a great stone box and hidden deep inside the tomb. A pile of rocks sealed up the entrance so that it was difficult for those looters, remember, for those robbers to come in. So they put these big stones in front. Afterward, all the mourners took part in a great feast. Everyone was joyful now, for the king was dead. So they were very, very sad, and now they're celebrating. Kind of silly. Tut was about to enter the land of the dead, so I guess they were excited that now he was going to this other land. He would live and be happy forever. They were sure that this mummy was safe, hidden away. But they were wrong. Wonder what happened. Chapter 8. Ancient robbers were not the only ones who looted tombs in Egypt. In the 1800s, people from many different countries in Europe began traveling to Egypt. The ancient kingdom was long gone. The old beliefs had disappeared. The squiggly picture writing hieroglyphs was a mystery to everyone. But tourists visited the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx. They took trips down the Nile River. They saw the ruins of old temples and giant statues. They wanted to bring back souvenirs. Sometimes what they brought back was a whole mummy. They might keep it in a room with other souvenirs they had brought. Why would anyone want a mummy? Right? It's kind of gross. But people thought this was a neat souvenir, something to remember it by. They might give it to a museum or an exhibit. Or they might decide to unwrap it and see what's inside. No, thank you. Unwrapping parties were held. One English visitor sent out printed cards for his party. His guests in London got to see a mummy, unrolled at 2:30. So that was the plan of the party. He invited all these important people to come and see what a mummy looked like. A German prince in Berlin had a mummy unwrapped on his pool table. If a person couldn't afford a mummy all by himself, he could join a group. The group would put their money together and buy a mummy. That's what a group of German people did. They each had a certificate. It was like owning their shares in a mummy. One man from Italy started a business of finding mummies to sell to customers. Sometimes he used a battering ram to get inside a tomb. Remember, what did we put in front of the tomb? Those big, heavy rocks, so it was hard for people to get inside there. He described an accident he once had inside. Feeling his way with a torch, he was looking for some place to sit. What he landed on with all of his weight were mummies. So what do you think happened when he fell onto the mummies? I sank right down in between broken mummies, a confusion of bones, rags, wooden boxes, which threw up such a lot of dust. For a quarter of an hour, I was unable to move. So he fell on these mummies. They're all a bunch of old bones that are very brittle. That means they break very easily. And they all broke, and there he fell, and he was covered in bones. It's terrible to hear stories about the ancient dead being treated like this, just so someone could get rich quickly, right? Why does anyone want to bother that body? Just leave it. Of course, not all mummy hunters were in it for the money. Some were interested in learning more about ancient Egypt, what life was like back then. People interested in finding objects that tell us about the past are called archaeologists. By the late 1800s, many tombs of the pharaohs had been found. The trouble was that all of them were empty. The dream of every archaeologist was to find one that hadn't been looted. So they wanted to find a tomb that wasn't everything was still intact and still there. Many thought it was just a wild dream. They didn't believe there was even a tomb left with treasures. Howard Carter was particularly the only man who thought there was. And that's it for today. I'll post a little bit later on for you to follow.